Hello, beautiful people. Welcome to this week's episode of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. This is the show where we talk about how everything in Montpelier shakes out for the rest of us. I'm joined this week by regular contributor Emily Kornheiser, who's one of 3 reps from the town of Brattleboro. Welcome, Emily.
Hello, Olga.
And candidate for the Secretary of State's office, Chris Winters. Hello, Chris.
Good morning. Thanks for having me on.
Well, glad you could join us. For those who don't know Chris, he is currently the Deputy Secretary of State. And Chris, remind me, how long have you been with the Secretary of State's office?
How time flies, but I've been there for 25 years. It was my second job out of law school. I started in 1997.
And you were in elections division for a time too, weren't you?
Yeah, well, I started out in the Office of Professional Regulation, which is the largest division. We do the professional licensing. It's
my favorite division.
Yes,
of course, everyone's favorite division that a lot of people don't know about. Emily definitely knows about it, though. She's become well versed. It's 50 professions and 80,000 licensees, so it's everything from your accountant to your pharmacist to your tattooist is regulated by our office. We make sure people have the qualifications to practice. And then we actually have an enforcement division to take action if they do something unsafe or unprofessional. It's all about public protection. And that's where I started my career.
Wow. Well, after all these years working in the Secretary of State's office, one question I've been asking every candidate who's come on the show so far is, of all the ways you can serve your community, why choose elected office?
Great question. Because I've been a school board member, and that was very rewarding. We got our little elementary school through a bond process and a renovation. So that was one way to serve. I've been a little league coach and a soccer coach. I love serving my community in that way. When I first got out of law school, I jumped on the Solid Waste Management District Board, so there's all these different ways that you can help give back. I was the first in my family to go to college. And so when I came back to Vermont, I went away for school. When I came back, I felt like I owed Vermont something, this little state that's given so much to me. I've always wanted to give back. So I've always thought about different ways to make my little corner of the state better, and how can I make as big a difference as possible? And so when I got this job at the state, at the Secretary of State's office, I never imagined I'd work for the state, but I found that I could give back in that way. I could use my law degree for good things. I could engage in public protection. I could help people solve problems. And so over the years, how can I make a bigger difference? How can I make a bigger difference? And this is the next step for me, I think, is to run for Secretary of State, because I think that's the way I can make the biggest positive impact on the state of Vermont. And it hasn't been easy putting myself out there as a politician, as someone running out front when I've been working behind the scenes all these years. But it's really gratifying, and it's what I have a passion to do at this point in my career.
Thank you. I think we are going to dive into our conversation on open meeting laws and public meeting laws. I think I should start with a little story, which Emily and Chris were hearing. And I go back to it because it sums up what's so fascinating about our open meeting laws, or our public right to know laws. It's kind of the big umbrella for them. Is in some ways, Vermont's is extremely robust and really wonderful, and really weights to the side of transparency as good government. And yet we have conversations like my former editor at the Commons, Jeff Potter, when he was new to the Commons, and so new to Vermont, because he's actually lives in Massachusetts. And he called up then Secretary of State Deb Markowitz and said, I need your help here. The select board just did X, Y, and Z, and I'm not sure that's acceptable under the public meeting law. Can you help me out? And her response was, that is absolutely outrageous. And he says, well, what's your office going to do about it? And she's like, sorry, nothing. And to me, that kind of sums up some of the holes in in our meeting laws. So I'm throwing you into the fire, Chris. Like,
Yeah.
help us understand that.
Sure. Yeah, we get those calls all the time. And we have to be careful because the law doesn't give us any enforcement authority. What the law says is that we shall assist citizens in guiding them with the right to know laws, the open meetings law and the Public Records Act. So we can give guidance, but we really can't give legal advice and we can't enforce. But what we can tell people is, well, the Attorney General's office has the authority to enforce. And then you as a citizen, you have the ability to enforce through court, which of course no one wants to have to do, but sometimes that's the way that you can force an agency to comply with the law if you think there's a violation. And then there are these instances where there's such a clear violation. We think about whether we should make a public statement as the Secretary of State's office because it'll make a difference. People will listen, and it might impact how that agency or board is behaving. But we do that knowing that we don't have any enforcement authority. And we also have to be careful because we often hear one side of the story.
Mhm.
So unless we're certain that there's a real clear violation here, we're not going to weigh in. We're going to give that caller the advice. You can go to the Attorney General's office, you can enforce it in court, or here's the law, use this law to go back to that board or that public agency and point it out. And when we have an email exchange or a phone call with somebody about this, we can often see in a local paper the next day, or maybe on Facebook or who knows where else, that the Secretary of State's office told me. So that citizen goes into the meeting or goes back to the public body armed with the information that they need to enforce the open meeting law. And sometimes that makes a difference. So it's a tricky line that we have to walk.
I think there are a lot of times that folks violate open meeting laws accidentally.
Yes.
I remember the first time I joined a town committee and like the reply all in the email was just,
Right.
It's a hard and strange habit. As we've stepped into Google Docs. So there's all kinds of ways that I think people, or, lots of town functions, I'm at the select board is like counting each other and splitting off, right? So I think there are a lot of ways that people accidentally violate open meeting laws. And then there are a lot of ways people knowingly violate open meeting laws. And certainly I've seen many examples of that in my time in Brattleboro. And when that's happening, a citizen coming to them and just reminding them that they're violating the law doesn't make any difference because they're aware of it. And what I've at least experienced is it's only like 4 people in town. There's this sort of assumption that the mechanism for correcting this kind of thing in an elected official is the election, right? Like that's the ultimate accountability for an elected official. But a lot of people need to pay attention for that to work at all.
Yeah. There's a big delay in time there too.
And there's a big delay in time, yes. And you need a competitive election for that to happen and all kinds of things.
Yes, shenanigans can ensue in between point A and point B, yes.
Shenanigans is the drink of the day, Olga.
Ooh, I like it. Yes.
So, is there something else? I mean, if elected Secretary of State, you would be also sort of guiding the legislative agenda, the change agenda for the Secretary of State. Is there something more that you would, more power that you would want, or more capacity that you would want to be able to work on these issues?
That's a great question. I just want to go back to where you started, though, that a lot of these violations are unintentional. And a lot of these folks are trying to do, would they want to do the right thing? They're trying to do the right thing. So that's why we make it an education process. That's
Absolutely.
why Jim and I go on the transparency tour. It's why we have all these publications on the municipal section of our website at sos.vermont.gov. Go to the municipal section. There's a guide on open meetings, guide on public records. All that being said, there are intentional violations. Happens all the time. And when we try to suss those out and figure out, which ones are intentional, which ones are not, it's hard for us to do without enforcement authority or real investigation or anything like that. But the thing that Jim and I have been arguing for a number of years, and I don't think this probably ever made it in front of you, Emily, was in the GovOps committees, was a public records and open meetings ombuds person. So that's instead of having to go to court, this would be a more accessible, bridge to getting things resolved. So an individual, we proposed it either be in our office, in the Secretary of State's office, or with the Ethics Commission was a proposal that we made at one time. A sort of independent body, not body, one person who can take those complaints, do a little bit of investigation, maybe arbitration, mediation, whatever it takes to try to get them resolved without having to go to court, without having to go to the AG's office, without a lot of expense to the person, making the complaint, to help guide that. So to say, in this situation, it's pretty clear you violated the law. So give them a little bit of authority, some teeth, so that they can actually resolve some of these instances. I think that would go a long ways toward resolving most of them. And then some would still have to go to court, and you could make the decision appealable to court. But it would, it came down to cost in a position. So we were looking for a full-time position to be able to do this. And I think it would be a good investment for the public's right to know. So it's a matter of prioritizing what we want to spend our tax dollars on.
I do too. And I think, it's in addition to sort of being able to arbitrate some of these conversations, I think it would be helpful because that person could also sometimes write those letters that wind up more official publicly and have more of a capacity to do
That's
the
right.
investigation that leads to those letters. But what I've also heard, and maybe Olga, if this is too early a transition, stop me, that there's this recent trend in using Freedom of Information Act sort of FOIA requests at the town level in order to sort of bury municipal entities. And I think some towns, some offices, some departments in the state government need some advice and some help on that piece of public records as well. And I wonder if you've thought about how those two pieces interact. And then I have all kinds of other public records questions.
Well, that's another great question. It does happen. The Public Records Act can be weaponized and used to kind of browbeat public officials or waste their time. There is the ability in the Public Records Act for you to ask to narrow a request. So, sometimes that works, not always if the person has bad intent in trying to request those records. It's really a really tricky, again, tough line to walk, because you don't want to say someone can't make a big records request. Maybe there's a really good reason to make a big public records request. So there are a few states that have explored language that said you can only make so many requests in a month, or and there are costs involved. So hopefully that deters some people from making huge requests because they have to pay for those copies, unless they're inspecting, in which case, if they're just inspecting the copies, they don't have to pay. So that's a tough one, Emily. We should probably take a look at it, because there are a few cases around Vermont that I know of. They call us, they ask for advice, like, we're getting these huge requests. Do we have to comply? We point out the law to them. We point them to their legal counsel. It's probably the best place for them to go, because they might have to defend whatever they do in court.
Yeah. And I think, I want to sort of talk next about that in the context of state government, but at the municipal level, when you're talking about one quarter-time clerk in a whole town,
right?
And like, does their attorney even really remember they exist most of the time?
Right.
And does the town have the capacity to wage a major lawsuit?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really hard for them to address, the small towns, the under-resourced towns, especially if they're getting hammered with a really big request. We're seeing it a little bit around elections right now, with some of the election denier folks, asking for questions, asking for information about voting systems. And we help the towns comply with those requests. We've gotten hit with them ourselves. So we've had to turn over, huge numbers of documents and emails, chasing something that we know doesn't exist, but we still have an obligation to turn over those records.
So this is not directly always helpful dealing with folks with malicious intent, but municipal, if municipal officers are putting together a big public records request, there is nothing stopping them from calling up the local newspaper and saying, just thought you might want to see this public record request. And so if it's something that is happening where someone is being badgered, you can call your local newspaper and throw some sunlight on it.
Bring more sunlight to the sunlight oppression. I like that.
Sunshine is the best disinfectant, right?
It is.
That's
It
what they
is.
say. Yeah. So there's the tiny municipality that can't handle this.
Yeah.
And then there's the great body of state government that has tiny divisions where generally there isn't sort of a public information officer in those tiny divisions. And so they are sort of swamped. But it seems, at least in my experience, that we're seeing sort of an increasing trend in secrecy in many of our, or holding close documents and information within state government. And the AG's office is sort of required to defend that, or just has chosen to defend that. You all, as sort of an independent office, like what does that look like? That sort of balance of powers, conversation, partisan miasma.
Yeah, good description. It's uncomfortable sometimes because we have the AG's office defending these agencies. We have maybe the Department of HR, or I'm just trying to think of some other agencies, the Agency of Education, saying, no, we're not going to give this out. We don't think we need to give this out. And then we have the little Secretary of State's office, little 80-person agency off to the side, independently elected constitutional officer who plays nice in the executive branch, but doesn't have to go the way, it doesn't have to do what the governor says. We try to when we can, but there are times when we can push back. And this is an area where, I've watched Jim do this for years, and I've been, working with him doing this for years now, where we think transparency in government is really, really important because it comes from the Constitution. The public has the right to know what their government is up to. That's how we have good government. That's how we have accountability. That's how we build trust in government. Because if you're doing things behind closed doors, you circle the wagons every time someone asks for a public record. That's not good for the public trust. So we do push back. We do oppose the Attorney General's office. They were defending, I forget what case it was, a public records case. And we said, we're going a separate way. We're going to file a friend of the court brief with the ACLU. And, we're going to be in opposition to the state on this because we believe so strongly that the right to know is that important. So it's a dicey situation. We do see agencies kind of circle the wagons and get defensive, and their first reaction is to stall, delay, hide the documents. When the first reaction should be everything's public, and we need to figure out if there's a really good reason in law to keep it private.
What do you think we could do to counter those instincts that seem to be growing by the day?
Well, and before you answer that, Chris, I don't know what you've seen, Emily, but just to make it a little more tangible for folks, in my experience as a reporter, I get stuck in what I call the vortex loops, where I'll call an agency and they're like, oh, you have to call our public, our media person.
Yeah.
I'll call the media person. Oh, I'll get back to you within so many. I don't hear from them. I call them back, don't return my calls. And so then I call the first person back. Oh no, you have to talk to our media person, And so there's I don't even get to really make the full request, even if I put it in writing, or I'll say what is it in the public records law? An agency has 3 days to respond. So 3 days will go by and they'll say, oh, we need some more time to find your information. 3 days go by, and so pretty soon it's just this silence and you haven't gotten the information yet.
And it's interesting. I experience the same thing as a legislator often. And I know
it's a proven working method, I guess.
Yes. And there's actually a memo that goes out at the beginning of the session. Remember, don't go for I think people talk about it as the duck walk thing, or I'm totally missing the good story part of the story, but there's a memo that goes out that's basically don't cavort with legislators. The session has started.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So Chris, how do we fix it?
Yeah, I think there's a culture of, being defensive and oh, this could be embarrassing, or, I don't want to give this out. So we need to shift that culture. we try to do that through things like the Transparency Tour and raising awareness around the public's right to know, so the public can put pressure. We talk about it every chance we get. So thank you for this opportunity to talk about it. There is, our office runs the State Archives and Records Administration. The Records Administration piece of that is the state archivist approving record schedules. So it's how you manage your records. We can help agencies manage their records so that when they get a records request, it's a lot easier for them to comply. If you hang on to all these old records that you don't need to hang on to, that could have been destroyed because they're just routine correspondence, it makes it that much harder for you to find something when someone asks for a record. So that's another service that we provide, is we work with all the different state agencies. And we talk there too about, these are public records. These belong to the public unless there's a good exemption, a solid exemption in the Public Records Act that allows you to hold it back for a good privacy reason. But other than that, you need to turn these over. So you need to manage these appropriately. So we try to teach, we try to educate. We can't enforce, but we can enforce the records management piece, which says that you can't just destroy a record without an approved record schedule from our state archivist, who does a really good job working with all these agencies. Some agencies are better at this than others. We're trying to bring them all on board. AHS, our biggest state agency, is actually really good at this. They've developed some great records management policies, and that makes them a better agency. It makes them more accountable to the public when they get those requests.
I actually went through one training with the state archivist,
Okay.
I think when I was on the Commission on Women. That was really great. And, in the legislature, different branch of government, still subject to these rules, we have a real resource constraint in that the attorney who assists with records requests is just a regular member of legislative council who is pulled away from their job for every records request and then not available for basically their other GovOps duties, which might even take away from your ability to get legislation passed. And so there's like this scarcity resource constraint problem around it, in addition to anyone's sort of fear around secrecy. We also don't ever receive trainings as legislators officially on this. We sort of, pass information from one to the other, but we've never had an official training on it. And people come to the legislature with such profoundly different professional experience with regards to computers and computer hygiene and communication hygiene. And so, there's people who've barely used a computer before in their entire professional life when they show up in the legislature. There's folks who have worked for state government and have sort of, a sense of how one might want to use personal and professional email separately. There's all kinds of stuff that really we could use a little more support on.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we'd like to be a part of that. We haven't always been welcome to do that kind of training with the legislature. But I think that's probably changed. A lot of things have changed since 2020. And you mentioned the technology. That's another exciting area. That's another whole rabbit hole that we could go down. But the state archivist is working with the Agency of Digital Services on automating some of this records management. So with all the digital records we have now, certain things can dump directly into the archives. If they have archival value, preserved forever, right into the digital archives. Makes it easy. The person who created the record and is the custodian of the record doesn't even have to worry about it. It's automated behind the scenes. SharePoint does some of that, and Teams all has some of that we can actually build in. So you don't even have to think about records management. It's something that everybody should be thinking about, but it's never top of mind. When you're doing your day-to-day, you're busy, you have those resource constraints. You're probably not focused on, I got to save that record, or this one can be destroyed. So if we can automate that with technology, we'll all be in a much better place. And with more things being digitized, I think it's going to make it easier to make that accessible to the public when appropriate.
And one of the reasons I'm sort of stuck on the capacity resource constraint part of it is because one of my sort of core values about government is that a fully funded government doesn't just do sort of the administrative parts of governing more successfully to better meet people's needs. It also does sort of the more abstract pieces of government more effectively. So a fully funded, full capacity government administration would better be able to provide transparency, communication, to the public so that it is then more accountable to the public. And that's sort of a piece of a fully vibrant government sector that we don't talk about as much as we could, but it's the core piece of the public sector.
Yeah, that's really a good point. We've been a couple of agencies like AHS, I think Agency of Transportation, now have these records managers embedded in their agencies. We train them up at Vasara, and then they switch over into the agency, and it makes a real difference. That's that resource that those agencies need to keep on the right track, doing more than just their day-to-day mission, but also that responsible administrative piece.
Mm-hmm.
Chris Winters, thank you for that feedback. We have to go to break to hear from some of our underwriters here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro. But before we go, I just want to remind folks out there who might be listening, this is kind of core for me, is that often I think the public meeting and the public document laws are treated as a burden. And they do require management, and as Emily said so beautifully, resources. However, that transparency builds trust.
Mm-hmm.
And I have seen people change their mind about one town event or another, or one person or another, based on public records requests. And sometimes the shenanigans have been thrown into the light. But sometimes people are exonerated because of public records requests or following open meeting law. So it can actually be your best friend when it comes to community trust and taking care of municipal and state business.
Trust in government more broadly, which is really core to our democracy, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks, Olga.
Thank you. We will be right back. Welcome back to the second half of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. I'm your host, Olga Peters, and if you're just joining us, I'm speaking with Representative Emily Kornheiser from Brattleboro, as well as Secretary of State candidate Chris Winters, who is currently the Deputy Secretary of State. Say that 3 times fast. And Emily, what do we need to remind listeners of?
Well, Olga, as a matter of fact, the views and opinions expressed here on the Montpelier Happy Hour are those of the host and the guests separately, and not the station, nor the platform, nor their employer, nor pets.
Well done.
Thank you.
So Chris, before the break, we were talking about open meeting laws and public record laws. And we also talked about how they can build trust. Where are you feeling? We talked a little bit about, the lack of enforcement power for your office. And I'd love at some point to kind of dig into what maybe some strengths or weaknesses in the laws themselves. Mm-hmm. But before we do that, since these laws are really about supporting transparency and allowing the public to redress their grievances in part, what to you does a good functioning transparent government look like? Like, walk us through some best practices or what it might look like for the public.
Yeah, I think we've often said that open government is good government. And another saying that I like to use is that I conduct my work as though, trying to remember the number now, 630 something thousand Vermonters are looking over my shoulder. I'm responsible to them in everything I do as a public official. And this is your government. This is our government. It doesn't belong to me. It doesn't belong to the Secretary of State's office or the Secretary of State. We're working for the people. So it's really important that we be transparent in all things that we do. We've talked a lot about the public records piece. There's also the open meetings piece that's incredibly important. All these public bodies that are either elected or appointed out there who are doing the people's business, they also need to do that in the open. And that's that trust that you've been talking about. If you do things behind closed doors, people are going to be suspicious. But if you do it out in the open, like you said, that I guess exonerate's not exactly the right word, but people understand where you're coming from, even if they disagree with you. They can see your reasoning, they can see what information you considered, they can see how your decision was made. And that really engenders trust. When I did that school bond for the elementary school board in my local town here in Berlin, we had a bunch of public meetings. We put things out on Front Porch Forum and Facebook. We needed the community to see our reasoning, our rationale, how we made our decisions. We didn't just say, hey, pass this $3 million bond. We explained it over and over again. We invited the community in, we had public conversations, and that got the buy-in that we needed for a town that doesn't always pass the school budget. But they trusted what we were doing because we were so open about it. So that's the kind of work I'm talking about as effective, good government, is doing things out in the open, inviting stakeholders to the table, listening, responding, not always agreeing, but at least doing it openly and publicly.
There's an interesting dynamic happening in Brattleboro that's made its way into Digger a few times around some decisions the select board made that we're not going to get into here at all. But I think a really interesting piece of it from sort of the 1,000-foot view, a little higher view than Kevin seems to be taking in Digger, is the fact that so much of what this rests on are some HR decisions and HR conversations that do need to stay private. And I think it's really been frustrating for the select board to see all this misinformation flowing through the community and not being able to do anything about it. It's sort of a really challenging thing for a select board that actually, I think generally in this last few iterations, certainly not always by any means, has really prided itself and taken open meeting laws quite seriously. So it's just sort of an interesting piece of the whole mix.
That is interesting. And that's one of the reasons we don't always wade into those things, because we've heard about, some of those things you're talking about. We understand that we might not have the full picture. So that is frustrating. I've experienced that myself, where if it's an HR decision, you can't talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
And there are good reasons for not talking about HR issues in public.
Yeah, absolutely.
This is true.
So,
go ahead, Emily.
I have a totally different question. So if you have a connected,
nope, go ahead.
Go, Olga. You sure?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Chris, it's really hard to run for office, and it's really expensive to run for office. And I've heard folks feeling concerned that you are still serving as a Deputy Secretary of State with power over elections while you're running for office. Mm-hmm. And I just want to give you a chance to talk about it, because I actually don't understand. Like, I know what some of the candidates in other, not in your race, but in other races do. Like, I thought I had a picture of their finances to some degree. And now I'm like, how did you take 6 months off of work? I don't actually understand. I couldn't take 6 months off of work. So I have a lot of sympathy for it, but I also, Yeah,
no, thanks for the question. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about it. I'm taking mostly 2 days off a week. Today is one of my work days, so I'm taking an extra hour today before I go into work to do this show. So I take time off to do my campaigning. I couldn't afford to resign my job. I've still got law school loans. I've got a family of 4 kids. And
you have 4 children?
I have 4 children. Yes, I do. That's why I've got the dad mug here. Dad many times over. I have 4 kids. 2 who are out of the house. 2 who are still in the house. Younger boys. So, I think the important thing to remember in an election is that the only ballot I ever touch is my own. Elections are conducted at the local level. Clerks actually, are overseeing an election and handle ballots in elections that they actually run in. And there's a statute that says they can do that, because it's important for them to be able to conduct elections at the local level, even when they're running. The Secretary of State every 2 years has to run for office. So, Jim's been on the ballot for the last 5 elections that he's been reelected for, 6 elections. So there is that separation there. There's really no ability for me to influence the votes or change the vote totals. The votes are totaled at the local level. Then they're reported up to the Secretary of State's office. Then we do a canvas to make sure those match. Then we do post-election audits. There are issues that could come in front of me, like maybe there was a complaint against my opponent or something like that, where we've already had this conversation internally in the office where I would totally recuse from that, would have nothing to do with it. We build a firewall within the office to keep me away from those kinds of issues. But there really hasn't been anything that's come up so far that would cause me to recuse myself. I know some of the other candidates, I think treasurer and AG, resigned their positions. That was their choice for whatever reason to do that. But I don't think there's nothing that would require me to. There's no conflict of interest here. I don't have the ability to influence the election totals in any way. And like I said, I still have work to do. I have an office that really, needs all hands on deck. Elections is just one of the 4 divisions that I oversee. I'm also the records officer for the agency. I oversee HR and IT, and so I wouldn't want to leave my team in the middle of a busy election season. And so far, I've been able to do both using my vacation time.
Mm-hmm. And did
a
you
lot of
find
vacation time you have saved up, Chris? You should take more vacations.
Well, in 2020, we didn't take a vacation. We were 24/7. It's an exempt position that I'm in. So I'm at, I work all hours of the day and night and weekend, and I'm expected to do that. And I have no problem doing that. So I do have a lot of time built up. But I still, even when I'm on a campaign day, I'm available by phone. I'm answering emails. I'm checking in with people all throughout the day.
So bringing it back to the laws themselves, I put in my plug with your last candidate that I think there needs to be an independent body overseeing some of the laws. I know the legislature does very good work with good intentions. Unfortunately, I think there's
about that one. I mean, you don't have to be that.
Oh, come on. I'm trying to be nice here.
I know, but it's not necessary. You can just say what you want to say.
I have a huge problem with the fact that one of the bodies that is governed by the open meeting laws and the public records law gets to determine what is exempt and what isn't, and gets to oversee these laws. I think that is a massive, massive problem. Why do we not have an independent third body doing that?
So an independent third body that would pass,
or even if just the Secretary of State's office, but not the legislature itself, that is governed by, you've got the governing the law.
Yeah, there are a number of times when people wonder, like, okay, they're passing laws, but they're exempting themselves. There's the Ethics Commission, but there are also constitutional issues there that I've heard Leg Counsel, explain, like separation of powers, and they're the legislative body, and the Constitution says they pass the laws. The judiciary, I suppose, could come in and say otherwise if maybe there was something unconstitutional or illegal about, how they're going about exempting themselves, or maybe choosing not to comply. I don't know, Olga, that's a tough one.
It shouldn't be, though.
Yeah, I think that the open meeting laws and the Public Records Act should fully apply to the legislature. I think the Ethics Commission and the ethics standards should fully apply to the legislature. But there are constitutional reasons why they say, no, we control our own destinies in those realms, and we'll say what the law is. And they're elected, that's another, it'll be 2 years before you can kick them out, but, or maybe less, depending on when it happens.
It is an issue that I've never had a single constituent speak to me about.
I don't know anyone but reporters who care.
I know. And, it's not even something that we've talked about all that much until we were preparing for these interviews. So I think it's certainly something, I think there are even advocacy groups that would be interested in sort of joining in that conversation. It seems like the kind of thing VPIRG would be a little bit hot for. Or the ACLU.
Yeah.
And so it's certainly, the debacle of the ongoing Ethics Commission conversations is far enough out of my purview that I have not weighed in very much, but it's it's silly. It's silly that we don't have stronger ethics rules. It's actually really troubling. And this whole, we all know each other and Vermont's nice, so it's okay, is just
Right.
like more usual Vermonty nonsense.
Yeah.
So
it goes back to trust again, I think, as well.
yeah, and I think that perception is really problematic because it is such a small state, and I think that it's so easy for us to comply with this stuff, and we do for the most part, and yet don't want those laws in place. And so there's the appearance that we are not complying, even though we mostly are. And so I think that confuses the issue even more for people.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's right.
So maybe we could pair it with health insurance and get it passed.
Oh,
Yeah.
There you
Health
go.
insurance for legislators.
okay.
Little,
Oh, a little carrot and stick there.
little carrot and stick. Except I'm like, yeah, everyone else is on Medicare, so they don't really need health insurance. Anyway, back to the topic at hand.
So I said my piece, I kicked my soapbox around. Chris, what do you feel are some of the strengths of our right to know laws, and where do you think they need to be improved?
Yeah, so I think it's great that we have some pretty good laws. There's a lot of gray area in there that we get questions about, but it's good that we are tasked with helping people with that. And we have a full-time general counsel in our office. Her name is Jenny Prosser. And maybe many of your listeners have people who are interested in Public Records Act and open meeting law, probably given her a call or an email at some point. And she spends most of her day answering those questions, which is great, like equipping people with their right to know. I think the open meeting law that we have is really quite good. And what I really love seeing, a silver lining of the pandemic, was this increased accessibility through Zoom meetings, through online ability to attend these meetings, attend when it's convenient to you. You don't have to go down to a stuffy meeting room and sit there for a couple of hours just to say your 5-minute piece when they take public comment, or to listen to the piece of the meeting that you're really interested in. You can have it on while you're making dinner or whatever, and chime in when it's when your time is up. And so I really like the increased participation and accessibility. A lot of people couldn't maybe make it to an open meeting, to one of their public meetings. And now we're seeing all kinds of people participating online. The legislature's seen the same thing with their broadcast meetings and the ability for witnesses to attend. So I think one of the changes we ought to be considering in 2023 is making that mandatory. I think a lot of towns and public bodies have already decided to do that. They like the increased participation, but there are some maybe with not so good intent who don't like a lot of participation. So they're saying, we're not going to do that option. We're only going to hold meetings in person, with the intent of discouraging public participation and public attendance. So I'd love to see that mandated for towns. Again, small towns, there might be a little bit of a cost to that, but most towns have figured it out by now through the pandemic, how to get it done, how to make it possible. It's pretty easy with the technology, with Zoom. So that's one of the things I'd really love to see increase, that and the public records. And
Wait, let's pause on the recording.
Okay, let's pause on that.
Okay.
Now I'm talking about the ombudsman, though, as a second thing that we could do.
So I agree. I think that would be amazing. I think it's been amazing to have folks be able to participate remotely. It's better for parents. It's better for folks with different mobility issues. It's just better for people who don't like sitting in really boring meetings for 5 hours, don't want to drive far, all these things. I think there are a couple towns that are just terrified of technology.
Yeah.
I think the resource constraints aren't as real as people think they are. And I don't think people realize how incredibly inexpensive the technology has become.
Yeah.
Like really remarkably inexpensive for very good technology at this point. And so I think that's sort of a piece that we could use some more communication about. Does your office have the capacity to really help people implement those kinds of things?
Not
Or is
really.
that something we would need to set up?
Well, VLCT, actually, the
Okay,
Vermont League of
great.
Cities and Towns, has a bunch of resources and best practices for those kinds of meetings. I know a number of, and maybe this doesn't apply to small towns, but a number of the public access folks have actually done the setups for the towns because they have an interest in broadcasting. So they have these great setups. Like I was in Richmond the other day and they have this wonderful setup with the cameras that kind of will swivel into people who are talking, and a big screen on one side of the room. It makes it really easy to interact with the members of the public who attend remotely. And, you know, what they say is, you know, I've got my road commissioner who normally would have to sit here for a couple of hours and we'd have to pay him. But now we can just, when the time comes, we can Zoom him in and he's here for 10 minutes and does his piece. And, you know, we only have to pay him for that much time. So it's convenient for him and it's cheaper for the town and all these good things. So VLCT has resources to help. Probably some of these smaller towns, I know it is inexpensive, but they could use maybe some financial help in getting these set up. And I think, again, that's another place where it would be a good investment in public participation, in public body accountability to have those setups in every single town.
There's sort of the flip side of that is, you know, Brattleboro for some meetings has been entirely remote. And there was a while where it was sort of like one person had to be there in case anyone wanted to be there in person. And there was sort of some safety concerns for that one person who was there by themselves. And I'm curious just your thoughts on the digital divide aspect of this whole new world.
Yeah, we took those calls too from various towns concerned about that. So the emergency temporary law goes through January, where you don't have to have a physical meeting space. That'll expire in January. And I agree with you that there should be a physical meeting space. We shouldn't do it totally remotely. If someone wants to be there in person, at least one member of the board should be there in person. We need to keep both options open. So I think we should let that expire in January. The physical meeting space requirement comes back. Multiple people can attend remotely. I think it's more important for the public participants to be able to attend remotely than the board members themselves. And then you'd have both options. But I do think it's important to maintain the physical presence for people who want to be there in person, who might not be able to or want to use the technology.
Thanks.
We have just a little over 5 minutes before the end of the show. So Chris Winters, thank you for being with us today. If this is my second question that I'm asking all the candidates who come on the show, it's Emily's least favorite. So I might be torturing her every time I ask it.
I don't have to answer it each time. I don't care. I just want you never ask me.
So looking out at the broad landscape that is Vermont, if there was one policy that you could enact, it doesn't have to be within your purview as Secretary of State, what that you can enact that you believe would make Vermont work better for everybody, what would it be?
Right? It's terrible, don't you think, Chris?
That's really hard.
That's why I ask it.
Well, since we are on the topic of open meetings and public records, I'd love to see every state agency fully engage in records management. I don't think people realize how much of a difference that would make in good government, in accountability, in access. If they all fully engaged, we could build a digital archives that could make all of this information so easily accessible to the public. I think it would rebuild public trust. It would make agencies so much more accountable. It could cut out waste. Boy, I think it would be a game changer if every state agency fully engaged in real records management. Is that a boring answer? I don't know.
No, but it sounds to me like on a policy level, there would need to be some resources and some training there.
Yeah, and I think overall, once you invest, you could invest the resources up front, but you would save resources in the long run if agencies truly engaged in good records management. You'd save so much time, money, space, and people power in the long run.
Chris, thank you so much.
Sure.
Emily, anything you want to add to that before we head on out?
No, I've been sort of struck by how powerful that can be. So yesterday I got an email from someone who I think does not live in Vermont, who went on vacation and was staying in Stowe, and the hotel they stayed at was didn't accept cash, and they were upset about that for some reason. And they realized they somehow searched the state, the legislative database, and saw that I sponsored a bill that would require that all establishments accept cash. Which I remember the chair of the Commerce Committee, all love to Representative Marcotte, was like, this is not a problem. This is not a real problem. You are not solving a problem, Emily. And I'm like, I am. The future will eventually come to this state. I promise. It's not here yet. I know we still don't even accept credit cards, but I promise you the future will come, and I want us to be prepared for it. And it was just, it was amazing. That was a few years ago. And it's just sort of amazing that like someone really was able to sort of get both their political and their practical needs met by just being able to like access our fairly well-run legislative website.
Yeah, the website is great. And that information was power. So let's get that power to the people. That's great.
I love that we're talking about power to the people with someone who is vacationing in Stowe also. Like, what is happening? What? Okay, sorry, Stowe. Anyway, back to you, Olga.
Hey, Chris, if people wanted to learn more about you, where can they go?
Sure. My website is wintersforvermont.com. For is spelled out, wintersforvermont.com.
Thank you. And Emily?
Folks can go to emilykornheiser.org and you will find links to all of the socials and past newsletters and this podcast and whatever else fun you want to have.
All right.
And as always, the Montpelier Happy Hour can be found on Fridays at 2 p.m. on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station, as well as wherever you find your podcasts, our webpage, which is the montpelierhappyhour.captivate.fm, our Facebook page, and Emily's YouTube page, as well as BCTV and many of the PEG stations around Vermont. So we hope everyone is going to have a good weekend. We hope you're keeping up on all the candidates who are on the ballot for the primary, because the primary is right around the corner. Oh my goodness. And have a good weekend.
August 9th. And
August 9th.
You're not going to be mailed a ballot. So if you want to vote absentee or by mail, request your ballot right away so that you can get it back in time.
Yes. And I think my local election committee takes bets on me because I always request a ballot. And I'm like, this time I'm going to send it in early. And then like 15 minutes before the polls close, I come running through the door going, wait. And I think they just take bets on, is it going to be 5 minutes? Is it going to be 10 minutes? I tell you, good intentions. Take care, everyone. We will see you next week.
Thank you. Bye.